Hi, everybody. My name is Jared Milrad. I'm the founder of Movie Karma. We're the nonprofit organization that created our podcast here called Rewriting Hollywood, which focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion, and representation in Hollywood. And I'm really excited to have a special guest today to talk about her latest project, an award-winning individual here in our industry. Her name is Maggie Cohn. She's the co-showrunner, co-writer of the new limited series, The Staircase, which is now streaming on HBO Max. It stars the incredible Colin, Firth, and Toni, Collette. It's a really powerful, based on a true story, true crime series that I hope you'll get a chance to check out. We'll be talking about The Staircase today with Maggie, as well as her background and what inspired her to take on this latest project. So Maggie, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you on.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. You have a fascinating background yourself, Maggie. Let's just start there. So I saw that you previously were co-EP on NARCOS and won a Golden Globe for your work on American Crime Story VERSACE, on which you were a writer and producer. You also went to Vassar College, earned degrees in political science and film, and then moved to LA and worked for directors Brian De Palma and Michael Mann. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background and what inspired you to get into the industry?
I think what inspired me to get into the industry is I have no other discernible skills. No, I got into, I've always been interested in storytelling. I've always had a very, very active imagination. I grew up in Maine and I spent a lot of time in the woods coming up with fictional scenarios. And I also just am very inspired by humanity and real life stories. And I think that's what drew me to political science, studying political science at Vassar and studying filmmaking, because I think these two fields of study very often go hand in hand, and they really speak to one another. I do think of TV and films as a medium which can, for better or worse, influence the way that we approach one another and approach the way we live our lives. So yeah, I think I just always felt a certain connection to reading and to watching movies. And I thought what an interesting job it would be to somehow participate in that. And so that's kind of how it just started off as a hope as a child, and kind of somehow I was able to accomplish it.
Yeah, that's really neat. Fascinating too that you went into political science and film, can marry those two.
Yeah.
Working for President Obama and kind of working in politics for a long time. So I agree they're very interrelated.
Yeah.
What did you have? Feel like did you have mentors, or were there folks that kind of encouraged you to take this path on? Because I know it can be a daunting path in terms of being in Hollywood.
I sadly did not have mentors. I think I'm a person that actually does really well in the face of adversity. And I am very motivated by people who tell me that I'm not able to do something. And frankly, that's kind of something that energizes me. The challenge of proving something wrong or a system wrong is something that often has been a motivating force in my life. So yeah, I do appreciate the mentor system, or I don't know if mentors, I don't know, there's some sort of hierarchical power structure thing with mentors that kind of strikes me a little, but the idea of guidance, of offering advice through one's own trials and errors and hope that somebody else can avoid them, or that something has changed enough that they don't have to experience it. It's something that is intriguing to me. There's this saying that's like, you have to pay your dues. And I think that's a horrible thing to say, because no one knows what dues you've already paid before you walked in the room. So I think that speaks to my, I'm
Yeah.
going to do it. I'm very self-motivated.
No matter what. Yeah, and I love that. We work a lot with through our nonprofit, a lot of underrepresented voices in the industry, and I'm always curious to ask this next question. I think a lot of folks are not as sometimes, to your point, there are just folks who are not from this industry who want to be in the industry and don't know a lot of the facets of it. So one of the questions that come up that I have for you is around just what a showrunner does in general. If you could talk a little about that, especially in the scripted space, but also was that a vision that you had for yourself in terms of a career, or did it mold and shape as you went along?
Well, I think generally a showrunner is somebody that, initially is able to have a holistic view of the season of TV or multiple seasons of television. The reason that's important is that you have, especially on a limited series, you're essentially making, and specifically when it comes to The Staircase, we were making 8 mini movies. And so you needed somebody that had the oversight over all of them, that could point department heads and actors in that direction. So I knew what scene came after, like what scene came next, what's happened before, what needs to happen in this episode to support the arc later on in the series. And so the showrunner's job is to be able to communicate that information effectively, but also to protect it from the ramifications that always evolve during production, whether those are budgetary constraints. COVID obviously offered a lot of obstacles. And when you're in the middle of it, you always have to make some sort of creative compromise in order to make your day, or make your block, make the schedule of your block, and make your budget. And so that's always kind of the dance between what do you cut or what do you change in order to accommodate those needs while protecting the story. And so, that was my job, was to to come up with the story and then to protect the story, is kind of the simplest way of looking at it. And in television, that's very essential because it is such a long story. It's 8 hours of story. In terms of, did I see myself becoming a showrunner? I'm naturally been inclined towards leadership, and hearing voices and, using, taking advice and, using it to better understand a decision. And so I think showrunning for me was kind of the natural next step in my writing career. I've worked a lot with directors, as you mentioned. I've directed things. I've worked with editors. So I had I already had experience in all the elements. And then this was a job that essentially combines that experience into one. So it was very, very challenging. But it also was something that I was very much prepared to do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I like how you point out those different elements that you need to kind of know. Well, you kind of need to know each part of the train in a way, right, to keep it going.
Yeah, but I also think that you don't necessarily need to know every facet of it. You just need to know how to hire the right people, and also how to listen. Because certainly I wasn't so well versed in everything. I had a lot to learn, and saying I don't know is very powerful. I know how to make decisions, but I need the information to make them with. And if I don't have that information, I'm going to ask. And I'm not afraid to admit that I don't know something. And it also gives you an opportunity to learn, and it also gives people an opportunity to become teachers themselves, which I think is really, it can be empowering.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious if you have thoughts around around this for folks who might be listening and say, hey, I think I want to I want to be that. Like that sort of describes a little bit of my leadership style where I want to go in the industry. Like, were there certain places along the road that you looking back, you're like, oh, I'm glad I got that experience or that experience that really prepared me?
Yeah, I mean, I think working as I started off as a production assistant, and I think I am able to recognize the contributions of somewhat of the, for better or worse, or for the worse, the unseen labor. You don't see my face on the screen, but I get to do interviews with you. But I worked 14-hour days, and so did a lot of other people who don't get this opportunity. And so, I think having experienced that, I do know what that struggle is and what's being sacrificed in order to participate in a larger project and a larger goal. And I think it's always great to reach out and try and appreciate that, and also know that like you do learn from those experiences, and if you don't want to, there are ways to move up the ladder, so to speak. But also like those are really fundamentally important jobs in and of themselves.
Right. That you don't have to be
Yeah, no.
that's right. It keeps the show literally really
Absolutely. Yeah. I didn't make this myself.
Yeah, it takes a massive team to pull it off. Let's talk a little bit about the series, because it's really terrific, and congratulations. It's getting rave reviews, rightfully so. For those who don't know the story, I'll give a little bit of it, hopefully not giving too much away. Of course, it's based on a true story about Kathleen Petersen, who was found in her home in Durham, North Carolina, in December 2001, allegedly by her husband, who became a suspect in a murder investigation, which has kind of gone on now for many years in different ways. And he was later convicted and then pled guilty to manslaughter and walked free with time served. It's we see these multiple timelines over the years in the series, and so I have a few questions for you just around that. But first of all, I'm curious, Maggie, if you talk a little bit about the challenges of adapting, such a well-known recent true story, which also had a docuseries I know you addressed in the show of the same name that aired on Netflix. What were just some of those challenges of navigating both the story, which is based on true story, but also the fact that there was already a docuseries about it and other coverage?
We are using the documentary as inspiration, and what we're doing is we're actually using the documentary team as characters within our story, and we're using that as a device to show the viewer visually and through theme and plot how a story is constructed. And so one of our major themes is about what is a story, what is truth, how do these things relate to one another. And when we see this documentary team enter in the second episode of the season, we begin to understand their process for how they picked the Petersens as a family. And initially how the documentary was not only going to be about the Petersens, but it was going to be about the prosecution team and then also the judge, and how slowly the nature of the documentary evolved over time, like stories do. And so it really was an opportunity to explore all the things that you don't see in frame. And then also explore a family that, when you think, oh, well, we know the Petersens, the family featured in the documentary, but I would argue that whenever you turn on a camera, whatever before you fundamentally changes. And so we don't actually know who they are. And we're, as storytellers, aren't telling you that these are the people. We're telling you that this is a story that could have happened concerning these people, based on what we've learned. And so the documentary team is just adapting this as actually a way to kind of use something that feels very familiar to the viewer, a documentary, not only the idea of what a documentary is, but this specific documentary about the staircase, and then subvert it and use that as a way of being like, you think you know what this is, but actually let us show you an alternative version of events that could be equally as true.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I like how you think about that approach, because I think it's sort of, there's multiple layers, and I've seen you talk about this in other interviews in terms of the coverage that's already been done and documented around these many events over many years. I want to also ask about the timelines piece of this. I've seen you talk about this as well, and I think it's really fascinating that the series is broken into kind of these multiple timelines. We as the viewer move between time essentially in this, particularly Michael Petersen's life. Talk a little bit, if you would, Maggie, about that decision in terms of how to structure the show and how we as the viewer will experience this.
Well, yeah, so we decided there's 3 timelines. There's the past, the present, and the future. And my goal in writing the scripts, the idea was that you could read a script, take out dates, and it would just read like a normal script, like the theme, plot, character arc, the energy of the scenes. We talked about that a lot because we didn't want to use visual transitions or we didn't want to make a stylistic difference between the timelines, like whether it's changing the tone of the light, changing a different lens or a shooting style, that we wanted to remain consistent throughout, because we did want it to read as one story, one timeline. And so I think that approach means, like, it's not flashbacks or flash forwards. It's just the idea that everybody's bringing something to a story. We all have a backstory that we're bringing to something. And we wanted to really embrace that with the construction of our season. It's a bit of a combination. I realized this very early on. It's kind of like the Titanic, but also a story of a death foretold, where you know the ending before it begins, or at the very beginning, you know the ending. And so what's going to happen between now and then, that's going to be new. And I think it really does speak to life. We all know that it ends, but like what happens in between is actually the story. So it's a bit lofty. But I think it was a challenging experiment. And I think in keeping the goal very simple of making it an episode of TV read like it was one timeline, even though it's happening in multiple times frames, it helped to have this like cohesion to the story that enables us to kind of explore these larger themes of what is time, what is truth, what is fact and fiction and storytelling just generally.
Right, and especially in this case, the facts themselves are so disputed even to this day, right, in terms of what actually happened.
How you interpret the facts is disputed. The facts themselves, I think, I kind of mentioned this just a minute ago, but the staircase itself, the blood spatter, the blood pattern that is found in the staircase, which tells a different story to everybody who looks at it. And it's not necessarily what happened that night. It's telling you what you see. It's telling you what you brought to the staircase before it ever existed. That's going to inform how you interpret the blood spatter. Everyone has a different way of looking at it, and it is a fact, but just because it exists and is somewhat objective doesn't mean that we can't bring our own story and make it a subjective experience.
Right. Fascinating. I was going to ask you about the challenge challenge of the opportunity this structure presents for actors, because you had such incredible talent on this project, and I'm sure I would be at least over the moon about the talent you've worked with Colin, Firth, and Collette, and so many others. I mean, really just all the way down the line. What was that process? I'm sure you're engaged in it in terms of working with talent and sort of talking about how this show is structured and how that might affect character development, because I imagine for them it presented some interesting opportunity where there are different times and different moments.
Right. And I think it was about being very very clear about what the entirety of their journey was going to be. Generally speaking, you kind of start off with those conversations. Who are you at the beginning? Who are you in the middle? Who are you at the end? And it's a conversation, and everyone contributes to that. And then when in the moment, when you're on set that day, it's about just reminding people, this is what happened before, this is what happened after, this is what's going to happen. So your character at this moment, even though we haven't shot it yet, has already been experienced this reveal. So when you're performing, keep in mind that while you're hearing this, hearing the conversation that you're listening to, you've also already heard this other thing that we haven't shot yet. But in the story, you've heard it. So it's a bit of like it's a bigger conversation about where your character goes, where one's character would go throughout the season. But then it's also a very like, kind of just a reminder of like, this is what happened before. And it's pretty just an explicit statement said like during rehearsal before you get into shooting.
Right. Interesting to keep everyone on the same.
Right. I mean, yeah. And when we were block shooting as well, which means we did multiple episodes in one schedule. And so we shot the first 4 episodes concurrently. And so that even adds more to the confusion. Yeah,
right. I can imagine. I want to talk a little about the themes around queerness and identity here, which I know you've commented on, and I'm just curious to dive a little more into. So this event took place in December 2001. It was obviously a different time. I mean, it was 20 plus years ago now, a different time in many ways, but including for LGBTQ plus inclusion, what we as a society, at least in the US, understood as in terms of identity. And the prosecution, I understand, argued that Kathleen discovered that Michael was bisexual and had been having affairs with men, and that was sort of the ways in which the prosecution attempted to say that that was a sort of motivation perhaps for him to murder her. He claimed otherwise. So I'm just curious if you could talk, Maggie, about this theme around how queerness or how LGBTQ plus identity was used maybe in some ways as a metaphorical bludgeon by the prosecution, and how it sort of emerged in the case.
I think initially in the case, it emerged, the way that we looked at it was there was infidelity that no one has debated, and that the infidelity was a man, soliciting sex from other men, whether he was paying for it or it was, a consensual, casual hookup. And so you have kind of 2 ways of arguing that as prosecution. One is that there was infidelity in the relationship, and that caused tension. But they then took it a step further, which was that the type of infidelity was actually as problematic as the fact that there was infidelity. So then the presumption is that Kathleen Petersen herself would have been angrier that her husband was having affairs with men, as opposed to had she discovered her husband was having affairs with women. And that is making an assumption about someone that hadn't spoken, publicly about that being a problem. It was always that Kathleen was the perfect wife, the perfect mother, and which is a hard, that's a hard description for anyone to kind of fill. But she was so perfect that she somehow couldn't accept her husband for who he was, which to me then suggests that there's some sort of tension in their supposed description of this woman. They're putting a prejudice on her that may or may not have existed. And they're doing it because it's a way to manipulate a jury, which is something that's very common. And to some degree, we want to deny it, is the fundamental part of our justice system. It is storytelling. And if you can tell a story that's going to make the jurors more likely to mistrust the man on trial, the woman on trial, you're going to tell that story, and you're going to use implicit bias and prejudice to your advantage. And we show that. And there's an argument for including it, and there's an argument for not including it. Maybe Kathleen was prejudiced, and so it would have really upset her. Maybe she wasn't, but all of that is, speculation. And so in our justice system as it stands right now, there's no room for speculation, and yet it's still there. Right. So for us, it's kind of exploring that idea, more of storytelling and using prejudice. In this case, it was against a man who was bisexual, and using that to their advantage. So, it is, I think, also, for me, and this is totally something that I can't put my finger on, but I imagine that, experiencing being in the military, being bisexual, becoming a family man, becoming a politician, and it was a certain time and place where there wasn't room to talk about that, as much room to talk about that, to talk about who you are fundamentally, when society is saying you're supposed to be something else. And that causes tension. I mean, it does for me. If I can't speak to who I am or what I need, I get that's hard. And I take that, and then I put that into the story, and I imagine that it would have been difficult to be a bisexual man in Durham, North Carolina in 2001, while also being a politician, a father, a husband, and a novelist.
Yeah, I mean, I interesting enough, watching it, I went to T State next door in Raleigh not too long after that time, and I was essentially a closeted gay man, still figuring my life out, right, in college. So a lot of my friends, including those who were politically active on campus or beyond, had that struggle, who are now out, right? And so it's really fascinating to see it kind of on screen. Obviously, we didn't live that life. We weren't at that stature, to your point, age. But I think, to your point, that tension is something that is really fascinating. I think important to also show and dive into.
Yeah, and I think anyone can relate to that. Even people that have more conventional signifiers in their life or whatever. Everyone has something that they carry some sort of discomfort with. And I think that we hopefully made that relatable in Michael and everybody in the show, because then everybody has some form of a secret in the show. And so it's about what happens when you don't talk about things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On that point, my last question is for you, Maggie, is just around inclusion more broadly, and particularly even in your role, because I think having now done work in the industry for a number of years around equity, inclusion, and representation, it does seem like we still have a ways to go, both in front of the camera and behind the camera, for women, for LGBTQ plus folks, for folks of color. How do you think about that when you're thinking about, say, hiring decisions or the types of projects you take on, and even the themes that you're exploring? Like, is that something that's important to you, of how does the industry better reflect the society that we live in?
Absolutely. I think it's just it when you're in, quote unquote, more of a leadership position, it's incumbent on you to remind people who, I think people fundamentally, and maybe this is a bit naive, want to do what's right. And I think it's about reminding people that sometimes when we see certain roles or certain positions or certain opportunities, we see somebody in our mind's eye filling it. and that we have to take a step back and think, why when I envision this role, do I see somebody that looks like myself or looks like all the examples that have come before? Take a moment and think, oh, okay, I recognize that. I've got that prejudice. Not necessarily like, now let's ostracize that person, but how do I fill out the playing field where now I have a spectrum of opportunities, which not only enriches the show, but because you have more opportunities, more people to choose from, more talent to touch upon, but it also makes it easier for people to get jobs. For me, I don't struggle with a lot of the things that many other people struggle with, but I also, on set, there's hundreds of people, and frequently people don't know what my role is right off the bat, especially if they're coming in as a day player. And I will say that not once did someone mistake me for the showrunner. So
Right.
I was asked what job I did many times, and it was assumed that I never once got mistaken for the director or a showrunner.
Yeah, that sounds right. The assumptions that we all have, including others.
Yeah, and if it's hard for me, I can only imagine the struggle. Like, so I just about reminding people that the world is a lot more nuanced than our small myopic that we all have, and it's just encouraging just to keep it open.
Yeah, that's the goal, and creating more pathways and pipelines for people to see themselves there, and also to not feel like they always have to prove themselves as to why they belong in that space. I guess my final question is just around what's next for you, Maggie. What kind of stories are you thinking about doing next? You've obviously done in this instance, and some of the other cases, you've done some really true to life stories. Is that kind of where you want to go next, or are you open?
I mean, I'm open. I think naturally that's like what comes your way. But I also, I started my writing career writing spec. And so I always am kind of becoming inspired by things, and I hope to kind of write somewhat of a larger feature. So yeah.
Kill it. See where that goes. Well, again, I guess say Maggie Cohn, co-show running The Staircase, which is now streaming on HBO Max. I hope you all check it out. It's really, really neat. It's a limited series, so no excuses not to binge it. Again, Maggie, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate having you on.
Thank you.